Can I say welcome to everybody to this event on environmental policy making after Brexit in Britain and the EU. I'm Michael Clegg and I'm the Secretary of Cambridge for Europe, and also joining us today is Paul Brown, the Chair of Cambridge for Europe, who's going to be helping with some of the questions and administration. Our speaker today is Professor Andy Jordan from UEA, so a big welcome to Andy. Andy is Professor of Environmental Policy in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at UEA. He's the author of several books on environmental policy making and recently edited, along with Vivian Gravy, the 4th edition of Environmental Policy in the EU, Actors, Institutions and Processes. He's advised the OECD, the UK Cabinet Office, Defra, the European Commission, World Wildlife Fund and the RSPB. In 2015 to 16, he advised the UK Parliamentary Environmental Audit Committee inquiry on the EU referendum. And in 2016 to 20, served on the Scientific Committee of the European Environment Agency. And Andy currently sits on Defra's Science Advisory Council Social Science Expert Group. So lots of knowledge and experience with Andy, which he's hopefully going to transmit to us all today. Can I ask everybody to mute yourselves? We will try and keep you muted whilst Andy is speaking. Andy's going to speak for sort of 20 to 25 minutes. We'll have questions after that. If anybody would like to ask a question, feel free to pose your questions while Andy's speaking, but we'll allow Andy to complete his talk initially. But if you'd like to ask a question, then do put it in the Zoom chat. You can either leave your question for Paul or I to read out, or if you're keen to read it yourself, perhaps you could just put read. It would also be helpful if you could actually label your question as a question, so we know that it's a question and not just a comment on how interesting the meeting is or something similar. Okay, so with no more ado, I will hand over to Andy.
Right, thank you, Michael, and thanks for the kind invitation to speak to you this evening. So while I just, I think you need to stop sharing yours, Michael, your slide.
Hang on, can you, yeah, okay.
Yeah, great. You've got it. Okay, so can you see the slide there, the first one?
Yes, we can, Andy, thanks, that's good.
Okay. Right, okay, well, yes, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. So yes, I work at the Tyndall Centre, which is based at the University of East Anglia, and I have been working on environmental issues, and particularly European Union environmental issues, really since the early 1990s when I moved to UEA, which had then and still has one of the largest and most well-known environmental sciences schools in Europe. And I mean, to be honest, for a long time, teaching and certainly speaking to the public about the European Union has often felt a little bit like this cartoon depiction here. And yet, certainly in that period, in the period sort of since about 2013, 2014 onwards, I have detected a really significant growth in interest in the way the European Union works. I mean, and particularly since 2016, I think for the first time ever in my life as a lecturer, I was started to be asked for more lectures on the European Union, which really was unprecedented. And really the European Union, I mean, I think what often used to put off students from studying the European Union was just the inherent complexity of it. I mean, this is just one slide that I show to students. It's essentially a very simplified diagram which shows how the European Commission and the European Parliament agree policy. I mean, and that's a simplified diagram. It's really complicated, and yes, for the most part, for many students, really quite dry, quite sort of arcane, and very sort of procedural. But I think really what one of the good things I think that the referendum did was energized people, including students and policymakers and other stakeholders to find out more about the way that the European Union works. And in response to that demand, a small group of us created this network. Essentially, it's a sort of think tank called Brexit and Environment, to provide impartial, evidence-based information to policymakers. And as Michael said at the beginning when he summarized my bio, we found that there really has been a very strong demand really since and before the referendum for that sort of impartial information on environment. If you're interested in environment, you can follow us on Twitter. There's a website address there as well. There's loads of stuff up there, resources, blogs, reports, and lectures, and all sorts of other things. So if you're interested, by all means, please have a look. We're funded, or were funded, by the Economic and Social Research Council as part of a bigger initiative called the UK in a Changing Europe, which is still running. And if you're interested in all things Europe or EU, then I strongly recommend that you sign up for their newsletters and look at their website. That's UK in a Changing Europe. And we've had other money from the Economic and Social Research Council as well. So EU environment policy, well, it started out in the late 1960s, actually, a long time ago. It's relatively broad in its aims. It seeks to achieve a high level of environmental ambition across the now EU 27. It's informed by a set of sort of principles, things like precaution and prevention, polluter pays. As I'll show later on, it's mainly regulatory in nature. The EU in this policy area operates via regulation rather than other sort of policy tools. It has very significantly shaped the policies of the 27, or as was 28 member states. But what's quite interesting about it, though, is that the EU is itself also shaped by international dynamics, things that are done within the OECD, for example, or within the United Nations. I mean, a good example is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COP process that we all heard so much about over the last 2 weeks. It's often presented, though, EU environment policy as being relatively top down, but actually I try and explain to the students that it isn't. It retains a lot of flexibility for different member states to do things at different sort of speeds, informed by this principle of subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be taken at the lowest effective level. And finally, compared to perhaps other areas of EU action, it's been relatively effective. It's developed a large number of policies, and also, if you believe the results of the sort of Eurobarometer polls that the Commission has been undertaking for many years now, it's relatively popular as well across all member states, including, incidentally, amongst within the UK as well, prior to Brexit. So you can see here very simply on this figure the growth in the number of EU policy instruments in just one area of environment policy, climate change. And you can see how it sort of started, well, this is climate policy, so it started relatively recently in the 1990s, and how it really sort of took off in the 2000s. But notice also how it hasn't just, the number of new policy adoptions has not just continued to increase inexorably. It's sort of tailed off, it's plateaued, particularly in the last sort of 5 or 10 years. And if we just go into a particular area of environment policy, so this is climate policy, you can see the whole sort of set of different sub areas where the EU is active, renewable energy, biofuels, the fuel that we put now in our cars if we're still driving fossil fuel vehicles, car emissions, emissions trading, labeling of products like kettles and fridges and things like that. So a whole range of different ways in which the EU is active. But again, if we look historically, and this is a diagram which shows all areas of environmental policy, we can see a number of kind of interesting things. So this figure here has sort of 3 lines on it. So that the first line, the line with the triangles, is the total number of environmental policy instruments adopted. And again, you see rapid increase through the sort of 80s and 90s, and then sort of plateauing in the 2000s. But if you look at the other 2 lines, so the darker of those other 2 lines, the one with the diamonds, that's the number of legally binding instruments, and that actually tails off and actually decreases in the last 5 to 10 years. Whereas the third line, which is the line showing the numbers of non-legally binding environmental acts, has actually increased, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years. So putting all that together, the EU hasn't just continued regulating on and on and on. The total number has plateaued, but crucially also, the EU is now acting more through kind of voluntary or non-legally binding means, and less through, sort of legally binding means. So the nature of EU action is also changing as well. And another figure, again here, this compares the number of new items of legislation adopted each year with the numbers of items of legislation which essentially amend the existing body of legislation. And again, what you can see here is that the adoption of new policy instruments has over time increased and then decreased, whereas the adoption of legislation essentially amending what's already there has actually increased. So again, what it shows is not this inexorable rise in policy, everything sort of gradually moving up to Brussels, but rather policy, sort of the number of policy items plateauing, and more attention now being made or being devoted to amending and improving what's already there. So I think by showing some of these figures, hopefully I've sort of begun, hopefully in a gentle way, to try and sort of demolish some of the myths about how the EU operates. So again, if we look at historically in a particular area of policy, we can also see a marked difference in the way that the EU acts. It generally acts by regulating rather than by adopting market-based instruments like taxes and emissions trading. I mean, it's had a go at using sort of informational devices and sort of voluntary agreements. Voluntary agreements, essentially agreements between the European Union and particular industries like the car manufacturers. But these generally have been few in number and generally have not been as effective as regulation. So generally the EU operates by regulation, and it operates by regulation because essentially the treaties, the founding treaties, require it to operate in that way. I think what's been really interesting about EU environment policy is the way that it's sort of stabilized policymaking over the last 30 or 40 years. You know, this gradual build-up of policy and its implementation by the member states. If we compare that, on the other hand, with the way that you find policies being developed at the member state level, I mean, this is an example of the UK, you can see a lot more turbulence. So what this simple figure here shows, I've taken it from the Institute for Government, it shows just how much change there is, political change there is within different ministries of state. So the main ministry dealing with environment, of course, is Defra. So you can see here just how many changes there have been in the Secretary of State over time. And some, I mean, for example, Ministry of Justice, has been even more change. So I think one of the things that the EU did was really to sort of try and promote longer term, more stable policy making. So by the time we got to 2016, when the referendum was held, we had, by that point, a very significant and large body of EU legislation. In Brussels speak, that's known as the acquis communautaire. This had triggered a very substantial and kind of wide-ranging Europeanization of both Westminster and also Whitehall. Most, if not all, policy by the 2000s was being, if not made by the EU in this particular area, or at least being sort of negotiated with the EU. A lot of what was going on in departments, particularly like Defra, was essentially about implementing policies that had been adopted at a higher level. And there were lots of important policy functions, of course, that were undertaken outside of London, in Brussels, in Strasbourg, in Copenhagen, where you find the European Environment Agency, and in places like Seville, where they helped to deal with industrial emissions policy. I think it's important to remember also that over the last 30 or 40 years, what you see really developing is a sort of a hybrid model of policy in this area. So on the one hand, the EU has had very heavily shaped the UK through adopting all of this legislation. But at the same time, you know, the UK had not just passively taken all of this policy from the EU. It had also sought to insert its own national interests and own sovereign demands into the process. So let me just very quickly run through this slide here. So on the left-hand side are some examples of how the EU has shaped the UK over the last, since 1973, when the UK joined the EU. So, of course, it's very heavily shaped the way in which new policies were formulated and adopted. And you saw all in those figures that I showed earlier how the number of instruments changed, increased very rapidly over time. It's kind of raised the political profile of certain topics that might otherwise, I think, have been neglected, things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, things like that. It provided relatively strong sort of policy implementation mechanisms to ensure that policies were delivered. So the Commission, for example, oversaw implementation. If there were infringements, failures to implement, then those could eventually be brought before the European Court of Justice, which could, in certain cases, levy fines against member states. So I think what policy making by the EU did was to lend national policy greater credibility. It took away a lot of that political churn that you saw depicted in the previous slide. And that sort of double lock, so things being locked into EU legislation, but also into UK legislation, gave investors the certainty to invest in things like water treatment or offshore wind. And from that, huge amounts of investment flowed. Things like the Thames sewer, the huge sewer that's being built to clean up the Thames, for example, that was largely down to EU legislation. And if, like me, you're interested in the politics of all this, then crucially what the EU membership allowed was for a very sort of interesting process of credit and blame shifting to occur. So if something generally went well with EU environment policy, then of course, member states were very quick, including the UK, to claim credit for it. If, on the other hand, things didn't go quite so well, then of course, the EU provided a sort of very handy scapegoat. On the other side, of course, the UK didn't just passively accept EU policymaking. It, depending on the issue, sometimes advocated higher standards in areas like climate change, for example, in industrial emissions. And other areas, it advocated for lower standards, water pollution, for example, air pollution. The UK has done a lot through universities and other institutes to shape the sort of scientific basis of EU environment policy. The European Environment Agency was pretty much set up by a group of UK former civil servants and many of the key actors within the agency, even now, are UK nationals. The UK in particular has helped to shape the EU's international environmental policies by providing the EU with sort of greater diplomatic capacity through its embassies and things like that. You see this particularly in areas like climate change, for example. The UK was always, when it was a member state, it was very keen not just on achieving certain goals, but achieving them in a relatively cost-effective and efficient way. So the UK was a strong advocate of what's still termed in the EU better regulation, of making sure that regulations are cost-effective, but also regularly updated and revised. And then finally, it was actually surprisingly active once it had joined the EU, and particularly in the sort of the Blair years, very good at sort of uploading ideas that had been originally developed in the UK and sort of ensuring that the UK kind of set the environmental agenda right across the EU. Now, what's quite interesting is that after Brexit, this pattern of influence, of course, is now changing. So I won't go through all of the slide again, but let me just give you a couple of examples of how things have changed. So on the left-hand side, thinking about how the EU has shaped UK policy. Well, of course, now the EU is not providing all of those policy formulation and adoption capacities. We don't have the Commission coming up with new policy ideas. We don't have the Parliament supervising it. So there's been a huge amount of new work for policy-making bodies within the UK. I mean, just last week, after essentially 4 or 5 years of discussion, they finally adopted the very first piece of environmental legislation, the Environment Act. So really the first big piece of environmental legislation, essentially since 1972, 1973. And it's been, I think, a big learning curve for everyone in government and also in Parliament. And I think what's going to be interesting about that is that in future, it'll be UK politicians that will be responsible for delivering on that policy. And if things go wrong, there won't be the possibility to blame Brussels or other member states for that. You know, the UK politicians in future will be sharing all the credit for it if it goes right, and I think should also share the blame for it if anything goes wrong. On the other side, I think there's also going to be changes for the EU as well, with the UK no longer in the room. I think certainly in an area like climate change, where the EU has generally been pushed to a higher level of ambition by the UK, now the balance of power within the council has changed. You know, there's now, without the UK there's more member states perhaps pushing for progress to be made slightly slower, or perhaps for the EU to go not as far either. And then also, I think, and again, you see this in an area like climate change, the EU no longer has the UK's sort of significant diplomatic capacities to project its influence beyond Europe. So I think really front and center really in this changing process of policymaking and politics is essentially Defra. Now, Defra, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, is within Whitehall terms a relatively small department, way smaller than some of the big sort of spending departments. And yet it's a department that is generally over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years really not had to, it never had the responsibility of developing significant pieces and items of legislation. So what this diagram shows here, I've taken it from the Institute of Government, it shows how many major items of legislation are adopted are progressed through Parliament by different departments, and you can see Defra way over there on the right. So again, it sort of confirms that until Brexit, that Defra is essentially a policy delivery and implementing department, not so much a policy making department. So there have been big challenges for Defra to deal with. It's had to be massively increased with resources since Brexit. It's virtually, the headcount has virtually doubled since Brexit. So if you want to know where some of the billions have disappeared to since Brexit, then yeah, one of them is into work development schemes within certain parts of government. So let me just finish now with some areas where the EU and the UK may or have an opportunity to cooperate a bit more with one another. I mean, I'm going to sort of gloss over all of the politics of, you know, Northern Ireland and fish and all over that, but we can discuss that in the Q&A if you want. But on the positive side, I think there are definitely some areas where the EU and the UK can cooperate with one another. I mean, one is definitely within international bodies like the UN, and you know, particularly on topics where the UK and the EU share the ambition to achieve higher environmental standards. I think on scientific, and I'm thinking particularly sort of environmental related scientific issues, there's the opportunity to collaborate through EU funding bodies like the Horizon Europe. Of course, the UK has not yet signed up to that. That's still snared in the whole debate about Northern Ireland. Nevertheless, there's also the possibility to engage in more collaboration on sort of less political issues like data collection, monitoring, and policy evaluation. The European Environment Agency in Copenhagen is responsible for undertaking these sorts of really important tasks. Unfortunately, the UK pulled out in Brexit, despite, you know, the fact that it could easily, if it wanted to, have remained an associate member. So who knows, with a change in political leadership in the UK, there's a possibility there for the UK to rejoin the European Environment Agency and become involved in sort of some longer term thinking and monitoring environmental issues. Meanwhile, I think there's definitely going to be cooperation on product standards, because if we want to, as a country, sell our products within the EU, particularly products with an environmental character, for example, and, you know, car emission standards, for example, or waste, things like that, things that are transferred between borders, we will have to collaborate with the EU and probably abide by the standards set by the EU. There are also things that are mentioned in the trade and cooperation agreements, things like emissions trading. The UK has essentially developed its own parallel system of emission trading. And also on new ideas as well, like carbon border adjustment taxes. This is a hot topic in Brussels at the moment. It's a way of protecting the high standards, the high climate standards in the EU from unfair competition from countries outside of the EU. And given that both the UK and the EU share the ambition to achieve high climate standards, and that this might be a topic that the EU and the UK could collaborate on. Of course, yes, let's be honest, there are also potential flashpoints as well. In the trade and cooperation agreement, there was a general principle that neither side should regress its standards. And I think, and all sorts of procedures that are in there, which one side can use to, in a sense, ensure that the other side doesn't achieve a competitive advantage by regressing or reducing its standards. I think we're more likely to see regression on non-product standards for the reason I gave before, and it's I think interesting that since the referendum, there are certain environmental issues that sort of sit behind the border, issues like habitats protection, nature protection, environmental impact assessment, which have, are in the crosshairs of those achieving, hoping to achieve some kind of more UK focused approach to environmental policy. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement also sort of requires, or at least requests both sides to progress their environmental standards. In other words, to keep improving them. I mean, they're pretty much in alignment at the moment after 40 years of integration. And there is the possibility, for example, if one side suddenly improves its environmental standards, to then use something called the rebalancing measures part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to ensure that the other side doesn't achieve a competitive advantage by not sort of catching up with the more ambitious party. And those rebalancing measures can involve all sorts of things like quotas and tariffs. And then, of course, finally, there are all these new trade agreements, or not so new trade agreements, that the UK is or has been signing since Brexit. A lot of them are not so new because they essentially just roll over existing EU brokered trade agreements. But certainly when the UK starts to sign genuinely new trade agreements, a new one has partly been signed with Australia, and certainly if it signs one with the US, then the UK might find itself diverging or wanting to diverge or under pressure to diverge from EU standards, in which case we might see, I think, more conflicts. So if you're interested in environmental policy, I mean, there are absolutely loads of books out there. If you're interested more in the sort of the politics and policy making of the European Union, I can recommend this book that I recommend to my students, the one by Michel Sini and Solorzano Borogan. There's a chapter in there on environment. It's in its 6th edition, so yes, very well used. I think a 7th edition is out next year. And then yes, as Michael identified or mentioned at the beginning, we have a book that I have been editing. It's now in its 4th edition. You can find it online. There are some of the chapters there which are free to download, so they're open access. So by all means, have a look at those. And then, yes, if you want anything else on Brexit and environment, there's the website. You can follow us on Twitter. And I think that's it. So, yes, thank you for listening. And yeah, I'll try and answer as many questions as you can fire at me.
Thanks very much, Andy. Andy, I think your camera's off, so you might want to put that back on now.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing this. Okay.
So I think we're just beginning to get some questions coming through now. Perhaps I could just take chair's privilege and kick off by asking one myself. As Cambridge for Europe, we're sort of interested in those sort of small scale, well, perhaps that's the wrong way of putting it, those issues which we can identify and campaign on, which are sort of slightly less than the long-term aim of rejoining the European Union. So I was quite taken by what you were saying about the European Environment Agency, and that there's no reason we couldn't be an associate member of the EEA outside the EU. If we were trying to, if one was thinking, well, what's the benefits of that, and what might be the downsides of it? Can you outline a little bit of what they might be? What would be the benefits of associate membership of the EEA, and does it have any downsides?
Well, first of all, I mean, the agency, the EU has lots of agencies, as I'm sure you're aware, but this is quite a distinctive agency. So it's not a regulatory agency. So there are very few, if no, sovereignty sort of related concerns, I think, with this particular agency. It essentially collects data that's submitted by the 27 member states plus, I think it's 6 other states, some of which are outside of the EU. So it's an open sort of, relatively open sort of agency. What do they do? Well, essentially they collect the data, they quality check it, and they publish it in all sorts of reports. It's an absolute goldmine of information, the European Environment Agency. Have a look. Very well used. It has a very good reputation for producing high quality work. It's used by the EU institutions to as an evidence base for policy making. It's seen as relatively relatively neutral, but lots of other states use it as well. So what were the benefits of the UK joining? Well, I think first of all, not only by sharing data, not only can we find out what's happening in other member states, but those member states can also find out what's happening in the UK. So hopefully that could engender trust, greater trust, that one side isn't trying to achieve a competitive advantage by regressing its standards or perhaps not implementing existing rules. There's also some kind of more subtle benefits of being involved. You see, a lot of what the agency does is it actually helps to inform longer term policymaking objectives. So to give an example, every 5 years, it produces a State of the Environment report. And I think the last one, I worked on it when I was in the committee, the scientific committee of the agency, was really heavily shaped the big sort of European Green Deal that was adopted in the last few years, which has then fed through to the big sort of Fit for 55 package of climate measures. So what that would do is it would actually give the UK an insight into where EU policy is going in the future and have some ability to kind of not only know where it's going, but possibly also to shape it as well. So I think lots of advantages. A membership fee will have to be paid. It's less, I've forgotten exactly how much it is. It's certainly less than 10 million a year. But my sense though is already, despite Brexit, there's still informal interactions going on between civil servants and parliamentarians in the UK and those in other member states through bodies like the agency and things like sort of informal seminars and things like that. So and one final thing to remember is actually because of the way that Brexit's been implemented, the UK is actually still providing data to the agency in relation to Northern Ireland. And yet has no representation in the agency. It's not in the management board. It has no representation in the scientific committee. It has no representation in the other decision-making bodies of the agency. So yes, we have, distinct lack of representation in that particular body.
Thanks, Andy. That was really helpful. And the last point obviously has resonance in a number of spheres. So perhaps I could read a question that's come in from Jennifer Zirk. And Jennifer, if my reading it out manages to mangle your question, then by all means come in and repose it. But Jennifer's asked, what are the consequences under the EU-UK TCA, so the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, if the EU seeks to impose new environmental requirements on UK-based exporters to the single market? And the specific example Jennifer has in mind is the proposal for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence for companies that's soon to be released.
Right. Okay. So what happened when Brexit occurs, or just before Brexit occurred? Essentially, all of the EU legislation was transferred via some, bit like a huge vacuum cleaner, was like sucked out of the EU and deposited in UK law. So the two, essentially, UK law and EU law, essentially are mirror images of one another. So the big question now is what happens after Brexit? Do they continue to align with one another dynamically, i.e. automatically, or do they sort of continue to align in a sort of more or less passive way, each side deciding to move at the same speed, or do they diverge? And I mean, the example that you gave in the question is an example where the EU might be anticipating a new area of legislation. So then the question is, does the UK adapt all of the law that it's retained from the EU to keep up with the EU, or does it in a sense decide not to do anything and by default diverge? Yeah. So I think this is where the difference between product standards and non-product standards comes in. If it's something that deals with products, then and where access to the single market is contingent on maintaining those standards, then those are that you will continue to see convergence, I think, or should I say, at least not divergence. It's on these issues where the trade dimension is not so strong. So where you're more likely to see divergence and possibly regression. So if you want some indications of what might be up for regression, then have a look at the Tigger report, the thing that was produced by the Brexiteer sort of group, which listed a whole series of different things. Have a look at what the David Frost group in the Cabinet Office is doing, and also have a look at some of the things in the Environment Act as well. And for example, it provides the UK with the opportunity, if it so wishes, or the powers to begin to amend the habitats and birds directives.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Paul's asked a question which sort of relates to some of the campaigning we're currently involved in and the European movements currently involved in. So Paul's question is, it often seems that the UK government is in rather a rush to sign new trade deals to show some Brexit quote unquote wins. How big is the risk that this will undermine UK environment policy and international standards or climate goals?
I think it's possible, but at the moment, that risk hasn't emerged because most of, if not all of the trade deals have essentially just rolled over EU legislation, and therefore that legislation, as I explained, is essentially now retained within UK law. So there's no discrepancy. I think we began to see some of the potential for divergence with the Australia trade deal, because that includes it doesn't include the same sort of commitments to long-term climate change mitigation targets that you would find in UK and essentially national policy. For example, it doesn't mention the 1.5 degrees target. So that's something that the environmental groups, Green the UK is a body that sort of is the network which coordinates all of the environmental groups. That's something that they're looking at very, very closely, because the trade deal with Australia has only been signed in principle. So we haven't yet seen the detail, but that's definitely something to watch. Any trade deal, I think the other ones lined up are New Zealand and the US. So in terms of campaigning, I mean, remember that generally, I suppose Brexit was all sold on the idea that the EU policy was not very attractive, and that international and particularly trade policy was inherently better. But I don't think really there's much evidence to suggest that the UK citizens like big trade deals. I mean, if you look at the opposition to some of the big trade deals that the EU tried to sign up to, TTIP, for example, a lot of the strongest opposition actually came from advocates and campaigners within the UK. So yeah, I think belatedly, I think the UK government has tried to engage with civil society organisations and stakeholders to try and bring them on board in the process of developing these trade deals. But at the moment, it seems to be doing things in a rather sort of stealthy kind of manner, which kind of could store up problems later on.
Yes, thanks for that. I mean, I think we're all, painfully aware of the Janus-faced aspect of lots of Brexiteers, where on the one hand, Brexit is seen to represent the ability for the UK to act independently, and yet on the other hand, the UK will do nothing to lower standards or in any way sort of reduce high standards. And there's that mismatch, that tension there that runs through such a lot of Brexit rhetoric. Jennifer's asked a follow-up to Paul's question, which was to ask whether there was any chance that or whether you think there's any chance, Andy, that the UK might eventually take a leaf out of the EU's trade policy book and subject proposals for new trade deals to a sustainability impact assessment.
Yes.
Or is that over-optimistic?
Well, it was one of the many ironies of Brexit that actually the UK, when it was a member state, was very keen on these sorts of assessments, essentially to keep the Commission in line, to ensure that there was surveillance of external surveillance of what it was doing. It was also very keen on evaluating policies as well and updating them and things like that. But there's no indication at the moment that the UK is planning to subject its to borrow that practice that was within the EU and use it in the UK in relation to new trade agreements. I mean, far from it. I mean, a lot of these new trade agreements have been negotiated and adopted at relatively high speed with very little stakeholder involvement. You may have heard about the Trade and Agriculture Commission. Are you aware of that? Yes. So very slow to respond to its report, and only created it after the environmental and agriculture groups kicked up a big fuss. I think initially, I don't think he even wanted to create such a body. So I think at the moment, I think the NGOs would like sustainability impact assessments because it really would give them some leverage in the process and open up what is otherwise quite a secretive process. But I don't personally see the likelihood of that happening too soon.
No. Although there is something interesting, I think, that comes out of some of those thoughts, that there's kind of there's quite a lot of dimensions under which improvement could be made. There are quite a lot of areas where perhaps relatively small, relatively incremental, but nonetheless kind of real improvements on the current situation are possible. We've got a question from Ellie Crane here. It's quite a general one, and people might wish to throw in their own ideas in the chat. But let me put it to you, Andy, and see what you might have to say. So Ellie's question is, and she says she's anticipating family conversations around the Christmas dinner table. Not that there'll be much on your Christmas dinner table, Ellie, in view of shortages. So any tips for talking to committed Brexiteers who still believe that the UK made the right decision, but who don't have the background knowledge to engage in detailed policy discussions? What facts or approaches might you find resonate with people?
I think that to protect the environment or to rejoin the EU, or
well, I think why not start with the first of those, Andy, as your kind of key area to protect the environment.
Yeah. Okay, so I think generally, and I'm thinking now about work that colleagues have done in one of the research centres I do. Generally, the Brexiteers respond very strongly to, of course, to arguments couched in terms of things like sovereignty and doing best by the country and things like that. So what the research has shown is, if you want to motivate people to act who are perhaps on, who vote Conservative and or voted UKIP, that's the way to get them. You say, well, let's do, we're doing this for the national good, or we don't want the UK to be left behind by other countries, or we want to ensure that the UK punches above its weight. So couching things in those sorts of terms seem to resonate more with those sorts of audiences. Yeah, I can send you the link if you want to have a look at the particular pieces of research. They're very well very well evidenced and and peer reviewed.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, it struck me listening to you saying that it's always seemed to me that there's a kind of there's a real difficulty with the kind of positions that tend to underpin a Brexiteering perspective, and what I would understand to be necessary for environmental policy, because in as much as the Brexiteer arguments have a notion of sovereignty at their heart, then because environmental issues almost all need international agreement, an international agreement that's then converted into some kind of technical legal framework that has some enforceability into the future, environmental policy is almost always about some kind of compromising of sovereignty. So, I've always felt that there was just almost an inherent in principle tension between those two things. But I don't, that's that's just my top of the head thought, really. I don't know if that feels right.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back to what Boris Johnson was saying just the other day after COP26, and essentially was saying, we did all these amazing things, and it's kept 1.5 degrees alive. But we couldn't, force these other countries to do anything to, phase out coal because, well, they're sovereign nations and, it's their sovereign right to do what they want. Kind of now sort of sidestepping the whole way in which the EU works, which of course is to share sovereignty. And then when you share sovereignty, then you've got some leverage over other countries with which you've established a long-term partnership. So yeah, I thought that was quite curious. But yeah, I suppose the other thing to say is that during the referendum, the environment was just not mentioned really at all. I think Remain tried to mention it quite late on, and David Cameron, in one desperate last throw of the dice, went down to Raynham Marshes, pushed very hard by some of the large environmental groups. But Leave said nothing about environment at all. I mean, absolutely nothing. I mean, just, it was message discipline. So I'm just thinking aloud here. I think for a lot of people, perhaps who voted Brexit, maybe they've really not sort of thought about, the environment side of things, because, that's not really the way that environment policy is expected to go in the next 5 or 10 years was never explained to them in the sort of referendum at all. Unlike perhaps some other policy areas like, immigration, for example, or NHS, at least there was some very rough indication of where things might go, but not in environment at all.
If I could interrupt for a second. I think one of the interesting things is if you're looking at topics, I mean, the food standards is interesting because there have been a couple of polls carried out over the last year, very large polls by Which, and I think Best for Britain and some other groups, and they've shown pretty consistent support for maintaining very high standards. And that cuts across the Leave Remain divide. It's something that's at very, very high levels. I mean, you're talking about 80% in some cases, depending on the exact question. I think in terms of trade deals and ensuring that UK farmers aren't put at a competitive disadvantage. Even there's also, I mean, that was pretty much the same results in Leave voters and Remain voters. And maybe that's not unexpected, given what you said, because it wasn't really part of that milieu. So maybe that's something in terms of what we can do. I think it's actually, maybe there is, I think, it's politically possible. It could be certainly be sold to have good alignment with EU standards. Actually, can I just ask a question? I'm just wondering. It's another issue. What we've seen in the EU recently is, I mean, obviously departure of the UK, but we've also seen issues over gas imports and over coal in Poland, the gas import Germany compound. To what extent are these issues within countries and the wider divide between the more populist, autocratic, you could say, countries within the EU and some of the more established countries in the Western Central EU, weakening the EU's leadership position on environmental issues, certainly with COP and other issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, ever since the sort of newer member states joined the EU after 2004, essentially Central and Eastern Europe, there's been a sort of a fault line between those newer member states who've generally wanted to go slower than the EU 15, and the way that particularly in areas like sort of climate change, but renewable energies and things like that, the way that the EU has done that is, as I think, was quite clever. Rather than sort of say, well, you don't have to achieve those standards. It said, well, yes, you do have to achieve the standards of the other countries, but there'll be funding for it. There'll be you can get there, but in a slightly slower way or a more circuitous way. So holding to the general idea that all countries achieve the same ends, but leaving the means very much for the member states in question to decide. If you're interested in this, look at the big Fit for 55 package that the Commission launched this year. It's just so complicated, and a lot of the complexity has arisen through deals between different parts of the EU on how to share out costs and how to ensure that all countries, eventually get to the eventual endpoint, but in a sort of fair kind of way. So different member states, for example, have different, so that funds have been created, for example, to help them make the transition to cleaner fuels, for example.
Thanks, Andy. Jane Kahn has asked a question that refers to the EU Green Deal. Could you give your view on the EU Green Deal? Is it something the UK should try to align to?
Well, the Green Deal was something that emerged when the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was trying to was campaigning, and rather unexpectedly was part of her election-winning manifesto, and then really buoyed very much by the school strikes and Greta and all that, has suddenly become the main thing now that the EU is trying to achieve. It wasn't so long ago that experts like me were sort of saying, well, it felt like EU policy environment policy was kind of in the doldrums. So it's really re-energized environment policy. I suppose what's starting to happen though now is some areas are kind of zooming ahead, like climate and energy, but other areas of the European Green Deal, for example, the greening of agriculture, are proceeding a lot more slowly. There's a lot more discussion and debate. So how's that going to affect the UK relationship? Well, it really depends on whether one side decides that it's, for e.g. the EU has gone so far ahead of the UK that it constitutes a constraint on free trade. If it is, then they can implement these rebalancing measures. I suspect that won't happen. Not least because they've got too many other things to argue over. Fish, for example, and Northern Ireland. Yes.
Yeah.
They'll be arguing about fish when there's no fish left. I think.
Yeah. But the other thing about the European Green Deal is how rapidly these have been rolled out. Because of course, had the UK been a member state, it would have been part of the European Green Deal, but it isn't. So that's proceeding. Meanwhile, the UK is sort of still, after pretty much 5 years of discussion and negotiation, finally got its Environment Act up and running. But that's going to take years and years and years to be implemented, because it's essentially a framework legislation. You'll need lots of items of secondary legislation to implement it. So it'll be interesting to see over the next few years, whether how the relative speeds of policy making and policy development vary.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, especially as you said before, the sort of some of these issues can perhaps call the lie of the idea that EU policy making is necessarily slow and bureaucratic. Clearly is on occasion, but not always necessarily so. And Westminster is not necessarily a great model alternative. I think we're probably almost on time now. Actually, we've got one very, very straightforward question, so I'll pose it, and it may just be a yes/no answer, really. So this is from Daniel Beck, and Dan asks: can Britain continue to discharge sewage into the sea with no longer fearing an ECJ fine?
As far as I understand it, after Brexit, all of the infringement cases which were ongoing essentially were put to one side and will not be enforced by the European Court. But interestingly, what's happened is, I don't know if you've been following this, but as the Environment Bill, as was, moved through Parliament, lots of environment groups used it as an opportunity to try and address loopholes in EU law, which essentially which allowed discharges of sewage into watercourses, during, for example, intense rain events. Now, any point the UK, so this relates right back to a directive in 1991, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. At any point, the UK could have addressed that and implemented the directive in full, but it didn't. It decided not to. So yeah, it's quite interesting how the opportunity is now being grabbed by the environment groups to kind of insert this new requirement into the Environment Act. But it's not an area of law that I know terribly well. But but it also took a lot of campaigning as well. Almost like a big kind of public campaigning event particularly over the last few weeks to achieve that. So we'll see now how well the UK implements it without the European Commission and the European Court looking over its shoulder.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So I took Chair's prerogative to start the questioning, and maybe I can take Chair's prerogative and end it as well. So we'll have this as a last question. We're probably all feeling a bit sort of copped out now after a couple of weeks of COP. But I just wanted to ask whether, reflecting on COP, whether it feels like the EU was taking a leadership position within the negotiations at COP, or given that sort of focus on the US-China side deal, whether the EU was to some extent being sidelined in Glasgow.
I wasn't in Glasgow, but I've heard sort of two stories about Glasgow. One is that the EU was relatively quiet, that a lot of the big deals, as you suggested, were done by the US, or at least shaped by the US and China and India, and that actually didn't really have a good COP. And then others have said, well, actually, in some ways, the EU has, by being so proactive at previous COPs, I'm thinking particularly at Paris, for example, has ensured that actually now all states are now talking about things like net zero and 1.5 degrees. So yeah, that in fact it had already done its work and could, in some respects, afford to sort of sit back a bit and put the pressure on some of the other countries. But I think the other thing to remember is that the way that the Paris Agreement now works is that all countries are meant to come to the negotiating table and essentially pledge what they want to pledge. the old approach, which was actually the approach that the EU originally wanted, which is where all sort of, you know, each country would be allocated its own emissions sort of reduction target. That just didn't fly. That's why the whole COP at the COP agreement, sorry, the COP at Copenhagen was such a big disaster, not only for the climate but also a big disaster for the EU. But the EU learned from it, and I think certainly raised its game by the time it got to Paris.
Thanks for that, Andy. Now, I promised that would be the last question, but I think we're going to give you another, because I understand there's, from Paul, that there's a question about the Common Agricultural Policy that I couldn't see. So maybe we could just get that in as
just a quick question from Linda that was sent as a direct one to me. So it's about the Common Agricultural Policy, not the COP, the CAP. Can you see any environmental positives of not being part of the Common Agricultural Policy that could be taken forward with Brexiteers? Then if positive ways forward are developed here, these could be part of cooperation and input to the EEA and influence Europe, or influence the EU.
Okay, well, I mean, I know that the CAP is not one of the EU's great success stories. I mean, far from it. But I think the UK could be proud in having in its record of trying to green the CAP over decades and decades, intellectually and politically and through all sorts of different ways. So I think one big question is how effective will the EU be through the European Green Deal at greening CAP without the UK in the room? So with the French farmers even more dominant, that's an interesting question. On where I mean, I think the other part of the question was about the broader campaigning opportunities. I think, as I said before, I think we know from polling evidence and previous examples of policymaking that actually the UK citizens are not, I mean, they might be suspicious of the EU, but they're definitely not in favour of big trade deals. Then they don't know how they operate. They're suspicious of the objectives of big business. So I think you've got a big potential campaigning opportunity there as the UK tries to, as the Brexiteers try and develop new trade deals. Secondly, I think the evidence showed as well, the Eurobarometer reports, that actually the UK citizens generally saw a role for action above the heads of state. You know, that actually they didn't trust everything to be dealt with by central government. They saw a role for higher level of authorities. So I think there's a possibility there to engage people with a discussion about how government is held to account. You know, through some of the new body, for example, the Office on Environmental Protection that was created by the new Environment Act. And thirdly, I think there might be campaigning opportunities around attempts to try and weaken existing areas of EU-derived law, habitats, nature, environmental assessment, plus other areas, you know, that are now being lined up for change, gene editing, GMOs. These are things that members of the public in the UK feel very strongly about. I mean, look at the size of the RSPB and its membership, millions and millions and millions. They may not be dedicated Remainers, but they sure as hell feel really strongly about the environment.
Right. Yeah, I think there is a definitely. I think we had a question earlier about what can we do to rejoin, but I think what you said there kind of hit a key point, that at the moment, while many of us will campaign to rejoin, and I think we need to be more out about that to an extent, but also there are other issues, and I think specific issues where we can campaign in a slightly less pro-EU point perspective, but to, you know, in a way where there are issues that are important anyway, but I think they can also, if handled correctly, can help to keep us perhaps in closer to the EU and to its values and its structure and organization. And that's I think that will be one of the challenges over the next few years.
Well, Greener UK is the network that essentially coordinates all of the NGOs, the environmental NGOs in the UK. It was formed after the referendum. That's the body that, yeah, that's also now thinking about new trade agreements. It's also keeping an eye on, you know, what David Frost is doing in the Cabinet Office. So yeah, might be a potential, you know, ally in what you're doing.
Yes, the more eyes on David Frost, the better, I think. So thanks, Andy. Thanks very much. That was really stimulating. Lots of really interesting ideas. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at the chat, but there were lots of appreciative comments after your talk. So thank you very much indeed. So thanks for everybody for attending. Paul, were there any Cambridge for Europe announcements you wanted to make?
Well, I think that's going to be our last online event before the holidays. Hopefully we'll come back off in the new year with some more events to be announced. We are having a stall in Cambridge on Saturday week, so the 27th. So if anybody is in Cambridge, if anybody can volunteer, we are always keen to have people join us on that. Details of this are on our website and on our Facebook page, and we'll be tweeting about it as well. And I think that's it for the moment. We will keep an eye on our social media and our website, and there'll be plenty coming up over the next few months.
Great, thanks, Paul. And thanks again, Andy. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the invite.
Cheerio to everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andy.